The dense formation that consisted of the Army of the Potomac's Black Hat Brigade formed on Joseph Poffenberger's farm at dawn on September 17, 1862. They then dutifully tramped south through the gray mist of damp morning as the crump of artillery and rattle of musketry increased in intensity in the farm fields and woods along Hagerstown Pike near the whitewashed Dunker Church. You're in the open of the rebel batteries. Brigadier General Abner Doubleday informed Brigade Commander Brigadier General John Gibbon as his men prepared to engage the enemy. Confederate shells and case shot exploded and around them as they advanced. The storm of the iron sent the men and equipment flying through the air. The horrific experience sorely tested the discipline of the Wisconsin and Indiana troops who made up the brigade, but they had fought admirably at Bronner's Farm in South Mountain and possessed the gift necessary to withstand the shelling. The 6th Wisconsin spearheaded the brigade's advance through David R. Miller's farm on the east side of the pike towards his sprawling 30-acre cornfield, led by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Bragg. The mature corn was as all tall as the soldiers who fought their way through it in that morning. Rebel skirmishers fell back steadily before the advance of sea blue-coated soldiers. The regiment went into action, straddling Hagerstown Pike. With its soldiers fighting on both sides, the companies of the 6th Wisconsin left consciously entered the northwest quadrant of the cornfield. A heavy fire erupted from Confederates in that cornfield, as well in the west woods. Rebel volleys knocked men down, splintering the fence on both sides of the turnpike and sheared off stalks of corn. The stout-hearted men of the 6th Wisconsin returned the fire, but they needed it. The storm of Confederate fire directed at the men of the Black Hat Brigade marked the beginning of a long and bloody fight that could elapse the intensity of their previous battles. The brigade's story remains one of the most compelling sagas of the battle that unfolded in the rolling fields that day around Sharpsburg, Maryland. Two of Stonewall Jackson's 4 divisions defended the West Woods and Miller's cornfield. The West Woods measured 300 yards wide at its southern end, but tapered to a width of 200 yards at its northern end. On the extreme Confederate left in the West Woods was Jackson's old division, led by General John R. Jones. The division's 4 brigades formed a double line, with 2 brigades in each line. The front line consisted of the 450 men of Stonewall's brigade, commanded by Colonel Andrew Grisby of the 27th Virginia, and the 400 men of Jones' old brigade, led by Captain John Penn of the 42nd Virginia. The second line consisted of Brigadier General William Talfaro's 500-man brigade. Talfaro was not present as he was recuperating from wounds received at Bronner's Farm, so Colonel Edward Warren of the 10th Virginia had temporarily taken over his place as brigadier commander. Brigadier General William S. Stark led the 650 muskets of the other brigade in the second line. To the right of Jones' division was Major General Richard S. Ewell's division, commanded on the day of the battle by Brigadier General Alexander Lawton in place of Ewell, who was recuperating from a debilitating wound received at 2nd Manassas. Ewell's other 3 brigades faced off against the divisions of Meade and Rickett. Brigadier General Abraham Durree's brigade from Rickett's division made first contact with the Confederates. Durree's men had tried to advance through Miller's cornfield, but were driven back by the Georgians of Lawton's brigade. These 6 Georgia regiments, which were commanded by Colonel Marcellus Douglas of the 13th Georgia, held a high field of clover south of the cornfield. When Douglas was killed early in the battle, command devolved to Major John H. Lowe of the 31st Georgia. The Georgians repulsed Durree's New York and Pennsylvania troops. As for Gibbon's brigade, the 2nd and 6th Wisconsin regiments led the brigade, with the 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin regiments in close support. With Battery B split to support both wings of the brigade, Lieutenant James Stewart led a 2-gun section that crossed to the west side of the Hagerstown Pike to support the right wing, while Battery Commander Captain Joseph B. Campbell stationed his men on the east side of the pike to support his left wing. As the Black Hat Brigade slowly made its way through the Poffenberger farm towards the Miller farm south of it, shells began bursting in the trees over their heads. The exploding shells rained down shell fragments, branches, and leaves on the soldiers. The first few shells burst into a rapid succession. Quote unquote, then a percussion shell struck in the very center of the moving mass of men. Dawes said, the shell struck a threshing machine before exploding, killing 2 men and wounding 11. The soldiers of the regiment pressed forward without halting and took temporary shelter behind Joseph Poffenberger's barn. Hookers arrived and made the barn his headquarters. Confederate skirmishers advanced into the cornfield using head-high corn for cover. Dawes sent his skirmishers to drive out the rebel counterparts. Stewart unlimbered his 2 guns in front of some haystacks near the barn, 30 yards west of Hagerstown Pike. While Campbell's guns deployed on a low rise east of the pike, Stewart placed his limbers behind the 2 stacks to protect the horses from enemy infantry posted 400 yards away. The lieutenant ordered the guns to be loaded and spherical case shot, an anti-personnel shell consisting of large iron balls designed for air burst. After several of these rounds burst over them, the nearest group of rebels dashed across the hollow and ran into the cornfield. Under cover of the fences and corn, the enemy crept close to our guns, picking off our cannoneers so rapidly that in less than 10 minutes there were 14 men killed and wounded in the section, recalled Stewart. Directed his artillery crews to fire cans of explosive filled with small iron balls into the cornfield. In less than 20 minutes, Captain Campbell was severely wounded in the shoulder. His horse shot in several places, and the command of the battery had developed upon me, Stewart said. The battery was taking heavy casualties at this point. The fence around Miller's Garden delayed the arrival of the left wing, 6th Wisconsin. Dawes ordered his men to knock down the fence, but it proved sturdier than expected. The Wisconsin men decided instead to file through a gate in the fence. Once through the gate, they quickly formed up alongside the rest of the regiment. Gibbon directed the 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin to deploy on the west side of the turnpike. Callis's troops formed up adjacent to the turnpike, and Bachman deployed his 19th Indiana Regiment to its right. These troops began a steady advance towards the enemy-held West Woods. Meanwhile, Colonel Walter Phelps' 1st Brigade of Doubleday's Division deployed in line of battle east of the pike to support the 2nd and 6th Wisconsin Regiments. But it proved sturdier than expected. The Wisconsin men decided instead to file through a gate in the fence. Once through the gate, they quickly formed up alongside the rest of the regiment. Gibbon directed the 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin to deploy on the west side of the turnpike. Callis's troops formed up adjacent to the turnpike, and Bachman deployed his 19th Indiana Regiment to its right. These troops began a steady advance towards the enemy-held West Woods. Meanwhile, Colonel Walter Phelps' 1st Brigade of Doubleday's Division deployed in line of battle east of the pike to support the 2nd and 6th Wisconsin Regiments. On the Confederate side, Jones had left the field early in the battle, claiming that a Union shell that exploded directly overhead had severely stunned him. Stark took command of the division, and Colonel Jesse Williams took charge of Stark's brigade. The front line of Jones' division initially held its ground against the Yankees west of the Hagerstown Pike. On the east side of the pike, the 2nd and 6th Wisconsin regiments paused at a rail fence before advancing into the cornfield. Shortly afterward, they pushed into the tall corn, halting when they reached a low ridge in the middle. Bragg took control of the 3 companies of the 6th Wisconsin and the Turnpike, and gave Dawes command of the companies on his left. As they were sorting this out, the 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin regiments became heavily engaged with Grisby and Penn's brigades, which had emerged from the protection of the West Woods. At that time, Brigadier General Marcina R. Patrick's brigade from Doubleday's division came up behind the 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin to lend weight to their attack against the West Woods. With Patrick's troops in support, Gibbon's 2 regiments on the right pushed forward, allowing the men of the 19th Indiana to fight their way into the north end of the West Woods. Private E. Stickley of the 5th Virginia Regiment of the Stonewall Brigade recalled the impressive advance of the Federals. In quote, "The Federals in apparent double battle line were moving toward us at charged bayonets, calm in time, and the sunbeams falling on their well-polished guns and bayonets gave glamour in a show at once fearful and entrancy," he wrote. When the Confederates moved one of their artillery pieces onto the pike, Bragg ordered one of his companies to move forward and shoot the horses attached to the cannon. At the same time, he ordered Company G and K to seize the cannons once the horses were slain. As soon as the 2 companies advanced, though, they spotted large number of rebels along the fence on the east side of the road. The rebels had another line of battle parallel to the pike near the West Woods. The Confederates opened a heavy fire on the 3 companies of the 6th Wisconsin and the Turnpike. Bragg ordered his men to take up prone position behind the Turnpike fence and return fire. The opposing lines were only 30 yards apart in some places. The rest of the 6th Wisconsin did not receive fire until it reached the top of the rise of ground in the middle of the cornfield. The Confederates in the clover south of the cornfield poured a heavy fire into the companies on the 6th Wisconsin's left. The bullets began to clip through the corn and spin through the soft furrows, thick almost as hail, wrote Dawes, who commanded the left wing of the 6th Wisconsin's battle line. Shells burst around us, the fragments tearing up the ground, and canister whistled through the corn above us. To support the companies of the 6th Wisconsin, already in the cornfield, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas S. Allen's 2nd Wisconsin deployed on their left. About this time, Dawes received an urgent message from Bragg instructing him to come to Bragg's position on Hagerstown Pike. When Dawes arrived, he found Bragg suffering from a very painful wound in his left arm. Bragg turned over command of the 6th Wisconsin and was escorted to the rear. Dawes decided to remain in the Turnpike, where he could command the 3 companies of his regiment, who were defending their position behind the post and rail fence on the east side of the Turnpike. From that vantage point, Dawes also could keep an eye on the progress of the companies on his left in the cornfield. Gibbon's troops in the cornfield advanced at an oblige angle with their front facing southwest towards the West Woods. As soldiers advanced, the men could see the whitewashed Dunker Church ahead of them, nestled in a nook in the West Woods just to the right. Unfortunately, they did not see a line of Georgians lying in wait for them. Simultaneously, the hostile battle lines opened a tremendous fire on each other, recalled Dawes. Men were knocked out of the ranks by dozens, but we jumped over the fence and pushed on, loading rifles, firing rifles, and shouting as we advanced. The 3 companies of the 6th Wisconsin and the Turnpike rushed forward to help their fellow soldiers. Wisconsin men on the left were advancing obliquely through the cornfield. The 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin, west of the Turnpike, held their ground at the north end of the West Woods against a concentrated attempt by the rebels to capture Stuart's guns. The lieutenant had ordered gunners to fire canister at the enemy troops approaching the guns. The Hussars fired into the flank of the attacking force, dispersing the Confederates trying to seize the guns. Backham then ordered his troops to charge. Hat in hand and sword drawn, Backham gave the order, double quick, and bravely led on. The men following cheering as they advanced, wrote Captain William W. Dudley of the 19th Indiana. The Hussars surged forward shouting, "Huzzah!" They followed the retreating rebels to the brow of a hill, over which they had a strong reserve of infantry and 3 pieces of artillery, Dudley said, as they crested the hill. Beckman was mortally wounded, and Dudley took command of the 19th Indiana. The rightward half of Gibbon's brigade had the Confederate of Jones' brigade on the run. When Penn tried to rally his retreating Virginians, he received a wound that would cost him a leg. Captain Archer Page of the 21st Virginia took command of Jones' brigade. By then, the first line of Jones' division had been shattered, and Gibbon's right regiments had taken possession of the north end of the West Woods. Jackson had assembled 13 guns at the eastern edge of the West Woods that were shelling the Yankees as they sought to drive the Confederates once and for all from the woods. Captain John B. Brockenburgh's 2nd Baltimore Artillery had all 6 of its rifled artillery pieces in action. In addition to the 3-inch ordnance rifles, the battery had a 12-pound Blakely rifle, a 12-pound Parrott, and a 10-pound Parrott assailing the Federals. Receiving heavy fire from the Confederates, the 19th Indiana fell back and disordered to the pike, where the officers rallied them. In the seesaw fighting, their regimental colors fell 3 times, but each time we rised again. Grigsby ordered his surviving Virginians to chance front to face east. They poured a devastating fire into the right flank of the 19th Indiana, driving the Hussars back to their original position alongside the 7th Wisconsin. Although the 2nd and 6th Wisconsin eventually drove off the Confederates defending the Clover Field adjacent to the Cornfield, the line stopped by common impulse, fell back to the edge of the corn, and lay down on the ground behind the low rail fence, wrote Dawes. One of the last men to run back into the corn was Private Bob Tomlinson of the 6th Wisconsin. When begged by his comrades to retreat with the rest, he told them he had a few more cartridges left. Standing alone, he fired his last round. When finished, he walked calmly back into the cornfield. Having suffered heavy losses against Gibbon's regiments on the right wing, Gibbs requested that Stark reinforce the beleaguered Stonewall Brigade. 1,150 fresh rebel troops surged in the action west of the pike. Meanwhile, Grigsby's remaining troops took cover behind limestone outcropping and continued firing on Gibbon's troops west of the turnpike. We commenced removing the fence in front of us when the enemy opened a destructive fire from the woods in our front, Callis wrote. Our men returned the fire and charged over the fence. The men of the 7th Wisconsin maintained a steady fire until Stark's troops emerged from the West Woods, crossed Hagerstown Pike, and fought their way through the cornfield. Most of Gibbon's brigade, except perhaps for parts of the 19th Indiana, on the extreme right became engaged against Stark's force. Stark, who was on horseback, grabbed his brigade's flag and led them forward in an all-out charge against Gibbon's brigade. Just a few minutes into the charge, he was struck by 3 balls that knocked him from his horse. He was dead within an hour. His troops initially drove the Yankees back, and the 2 sides exchanged fire across Hagerstown Turnpike. Some of the Confederates managed to scale the fence and take up a position in the road, but were soon forced to retreat. The Yankees prevailed and dislodged the rebels, firing at the Confederates as they retreated to the West Woods. Stark's brigade lost nearly 300 men, and Talfaro's brigade lost 170. The soldiers of Gibbon's brigade, who had engaged Stark's rebels, found that their rifle muskets had become so fouled that it was difficult for them to drive home a bullet with their ramrods. As a result, their fire slowed considerably. The 14th Brooklyn Regiment and the 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters of Phelps Brigade arrived to reinforce exhausted men of the 6th Wisconsin, taking up positions behind them. Though some men of the 14th Brooklyn and the Sharpshooters stepped forward to fight alongside the 6th Wisconsin, these commands became intermingled, with the black hats of Badgers interspersed here and there with all the red kepis and trousers of the Empire Staters and the dark green uniforms of the Sharpshooters. Men and officers of New York and Wisconsin are fused into a common mass in the frantic struggle to shoot fast, wrote Dawes. Everyone tears cartridges, loads, passes guns, or shoots. Men are falling in their places or running back into the corn. This line was soon ravaged by rebel artillery and musketry. Men fell to the ground, dead or grievously wounded because of this. The survivors took it upon themselves to withdraw to a depression in the ground, where their officers rallied them. The soldiers from Wisconsin and New York advanced into the clover field once again. They were approaching the Dunker Church when Confederate reinforcements swept out of the West Woods and overran their right flank. Dawes said that the volley cut through their line like a scythe. The Yankees retreated in disorder through the cornfield with the Confederates close behind. These fresh troops belonged to Brigadier General John B. Hood's division of Longstreet's 1st Corps. Lee had earlier sent them to Jackson to reinforce his left wing. Before the battle began, Hood asked Jackson for permission to allow his men to cook breakfast. They had just received a meat ration and had hardly had anything to eat in a week of hard marching. Jackson had granted Hood's request on the condition that if they were needed, they would respond immediately. Interrupted while they were still cooking their food, these rebels were angry and planned to vent their wrath on the Yankees. The Confederates of Hood Division surged north, screaming the high-pitched, blood-curdling rebel yell. Hood's old brigade, led by Colonel William Wilford of Georgia, had earned a reputation as shock troops for piercing a heavily fortified Union line at Gaines' Mill 2 months earlier. And then performance that morning further solidified that reputation. Hood's men cleared the cornfield of Yankees. Lieutenant Colonel B.F. Carter, commanding the 4th Texas Infantry, stumbled upon the Federals in strong force in a ravine to the left of the turnpike. This force was 3 companies of the 6th Wisconsin, who had withdrawn from their vulnerable position on Hagerstown Pike and had taken shelter in the ravine. The Yankees poured a destructive fire upon us, wrote Carter. The lieutenant ordered his regiment to wheel the left and take shelter behind the rail fence. The 3 Wisconsin companies then withdraw to join the rest of their regiments north of the cornfield. The Confederate counterattack had driven the Yankees from the cornfield back upon their reserves. Hood states in his battle report, given accounts echoed that of Hood. Under repeated assaults, my men now come rapidly to the rear, he wrote. Across Hagerstown Pike from the 6th Wisconsin, Dawes could see one of the cannons of Stewart's section of Battery B in action near some straw stacks. The close proximity of Hood's line posed a dire threat to Stewart's 2 guns. Seeing the danger, Gibbon ordered Dawes to save them. The major grabbed his regimental colors and led the survivors across the pike to secure the guns. Seeing the crisis unfold, Gibbon called on Doubleday for assistance. Doubleday responded by sending half of a New York regiment, but, as it turned out, they were not needed. The heavy fire from Stewart's guns had succeeded in keeping the rebels at bay. Nothing could withstand the fire of those double-shotted Napoleons, which had finally beat off the enemy, wrote Gibbon. As soon as the rebel attack played itself out, Stewart was able to limber his 2 cannons and withdraw north through the double gates of Miller's Garden. The retreat through the north woods to Poffenberger Barn was not easy. Bullets, shot, and shell fired by the enemy in the cornfield were still flying thickly around us, striking the trees in the woods and cutting off the limbs, wrote Dawes, after retreating to the barn. Dawes positioned his men under the best shelter he could find, and then went about tallying their losses. The 7th Wisconsin and 19th Indiana were still on the edge of the west woods that extended to the southwest corner of the Miller Field. Facing east, the Confederates had positioned an artillery battery 300 yards to their right. A heavy force of infantry was assigned to support the battery. They began throwing canister into our ranks with terrible effect, wrote Callis. The 2 regiments retreated from the west woods and rejoined the rest of the brigade in the rear. A heavy force of the enemy had taken possession, and from the sun's rays falling on their bayonets projecting above the corn, I could see that the field was filling with the enemy, wrote Hooker. The 1st Corps commander ordered 6 batteries to be unlimbered and placed in a ravine between the north woods and the cornfield. The Union artillery wrought havoc on the Confederates' positions. Every stalk of corn was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife, and slain lay and rose precisely as they had stood in their ranks, Hooker said of the carnage in Miller's cornfield. Of the approximately 800 men of the Black Hat Brigade who went into action that day, 348 became casualties. When it was all over, the cost of the fighting on September 17th was staggering. The Federals suffered 2,108 dead and 9,540 wounded, whereas the Confederates suffered 1,546 killed and 7,752 wounded. 1 in every 4 Union soldier and 1 in every 3 Confederates became casualties at Antietam. When the American Civil War ended in 1865, the Battle of Antietam would stand out as the single bloodiest day in the war.